Hi, good afternoon, and welcome back to the session on lesson planning, which is primarily looking at the first unit in terms of covering lesson planning. Hi, good afternoon, and welcome back to the. So this is looking at covering the unit, which is lesson planning, and we are on the learning outcome 4 today. So just a bit of a quick recap in terms of what we did and covered yesterday in terms of learning outcome 3. We looked at the essence of, how do we plan an effective lesson for the class? And this is to look at taking into account adaptability and flexibility from a point of view of different type of learners, different learners from different background or different learners with, or let's say learners with different requirements. And that could be because of disability in terms of special needs. And the idea was to try and look at how do we look at effectively, create a lesson plan which will address and take along and help us engage and interact with all the types of different types of learners in the classroom. And we looked at a few bits in terms of some templates, which are actual templates of lesson planning, looking at how do we look at allocation of resources, and then at the same time looked at, how can the lessons be designed in a way using these tools and techniques to ensure that we are able to create an inclusive classroom for teaching and learning when we do create our lesson plans. Now, today we are looking at going into learning outcome 4, which is basically looking at being able to apply theories of teaching and learning to lesson planning. So today's session is going to be focused on understanding some of the key theoretical frameworks and what these frameworks are, and how do we look at using these theoretical frameworks to better and make a effective lesson plan which is going to suit the profile of our learners that we teach in the class or online. Now, there are 3 assessment criteria in this. One talks about designing a lesson plan that meets the individual needs of learners. So here we'll be closely looking at the lesson planning and then also related to the individual learning plan or ILP that we draw for learners by adding activities to help them cover some of the gap areas or skills or deficiency in skills which are required to be able to meet by giving them individual activities using the individual learning plan or ILP. The second one that we are looking at is using lesson plans to monitor learners' achievement and progress. So how do we look at lesson planning as a tool, as a technique to ensure that the aims and objectives of why this lesson has been set up or what is being taught and delivered is essentially being delivered, and is the lesson that we do in terms of delivery is making making sense in terms of helping the learners achieve the learning objectives. So here the thing that we are going to discuss in a bit more detail will be the feedback and assessment part of the process, which is an integral part of lesson planning, and how do we build that in so that we are able to use this as a tool to track our learners' progress in the classroom. The last assessment criteria talks about how do we enable learners and others to provide feedback to inform lesson planning. So again, the process of reporting and also recording outcomes that we generally do in the case of lesson planning, which could be through assessment, various different forms of assessments that we do, which we include them as far as assessment methods are concerned in the case of lesson planning, would be to then look at using them, things like examinations, summative feedbacks, formative feedbacks, looking at observation reports, or any sort of corrective action plan which has been put in place in order to ensure that the learners are able to meet the objectives, would be looking into some of them. Sometimes we also look at the evidence tracking log or ETL in terms of how learners are completing some of the assessments in the assignments or in the units that is being taught. So we use ETLs or evidence tracking logs, and those logs will be essentially useful for us to be able to build feedback, use them, and then the feedback captured in them to be able to inform lesson planning so that we are able to course correct and adapt these lesson plans to meet the changing needs or evolving needs of our learners in the classroom or when you're teaching in the classroom or online. In order to discuss this particular assessment criteria, 4.1, 2, and 3, and the learning outcome 4, I've got a presentation, a few presentation slides that we'll go through. And these slides will essentially be looking at informing us on what is required to be covered in terms of the indicative content. So we are looking at here, how do we take peer feedback, or look at the opportunities of doing reflection with regards to what is being used and being done for teaching and learning. Apart from that, we'll also look at formal, holistic, and summative feedback, and then what are the outcomes that we expect to get when we look at taking feedback from learners, and how does it play into helping us to refine and adapt our lesson planning techniques. Now, to start with, what I want to do is obviously discuss, what are the key theoretical frameworks of teaching and learning, and how do we apply them in our classroom. So I've got a video which I would want to play, and this particular video would essentially be showing the application of learning theories from a point of view of classroom in general. So let's listen in and watch this particular brief video, which will allow us to understand how the theories of teaching and learning can apply to lesson planning. So let me share my screen. So just muted the volume for a second, let the ad go through, and then we'll get on with playing the video, which is going to go through and help us understand the application of learning theories in classroom. So let's listen in.
Ms. Marisa Malcobia Cruz, to my online classmates, a pleasant day to all. I am tasked to discuss the application of learning theories in classroom. But before that, let me first introduce myself. I am Mary Hazel Abard.
I'm going to forward the introduction and go straight to the theoretical framework.
How knowledge is created and how learning takes place. Learning designers can apply this framework according to different learning and learner needs and make more informed decisions about choosing the right instructional practices. No two students are alike, and the way every person learns will vary. Our brains are all unique, and our experiences all contribute to the different ways we learn. Psychologists have spent countless hours performing tests to better understand how students learn. Current and aspiring teachers need to be educated to be prepared for teaching students every day. And an important part of teacher education is understanding different ways of learning. There are many solidified learning theories that teachers can learn from as they prepare to help students in the classroom. Teachers who understand learning theories can use different techniques in their classrooms to cater to different kinds of learning. This can help all students find success in learning. There are 5 main educational learning theories that educators can utilize to help them enhance their classrooms and make them better learning environments for all students. So what are the 5 main educational learning theories? We have here cognitive learning theory, behaviorism learning theory, constructivism, humanism, and connectivism. The first learning theory is the cognitive learning theory. Cognitive learning theory looks at the way people think. Mental processes are an important part in understanding how we learn. The cognitive theory understands that learners can be influenced by both internal and external elements. Plato and Descartes are 2 of the first philosophers that focused on cognition and how we as human beings think. Many other researchers look deeper into the idea of how we think, spurring more research. John Piaget is a highly important figure in the field of cognitive psychology, and his work focuses on environments and internal structures and how they impact learning. Cognitive theory has developed over time, breaking off into sub-theories that focus on unique elements of learning and understanding. At the most basic level, the cognitive theory suggests that internal thoughts and an external force are both an important part of the cognitive process. And as students understand how their thinking impacts their learning and behavior, they are able to have more control over it. Cognitive learning theory impacts students because their understanding of their thought process can help them learn. Teachers can give students opportunities to ask questions, to fail, and think out loud. These strategies can help students understand how their thought process works and utilize his knowledge to construct better learning opportunities. The second learning theory is the behaviorism learning theory. It is the idea that how a student behaves is based on their interaction with their environment. It suggests that behaviors are influenced and learned from external forces rather than internal forces. Psychologists have been developing the idea of behaviorism since the 19th century. Behavioral learning theory is the basis for psychology that can be observed and quantified. Positive reinforcement is a popular element of behaviorism. Classical conditioning observed in Pavlov's dog experiments suggests that behaviors are directly motivated by the reward that can be obtained. Teachers in a classroom can utilize positive reinforcement to help students better learn a concept. Students who receive positive reinforcement are more likely or most likely to retain information moving forward, a direct result of behaviorism theory.
So there's a bit of a, let's say, the advert in this. Let's skip that advert and go back in. So what I'm going to do is obviously let's look at shifting back to our presentation. The reason I would do that is I think there might be a couple of other videos in this, but let's see if it pops back again. Then we'll go back to the presentation.
Students take what they're being taught and add it to their previous knowledge and experiences, creating a reality that's unique to them. This learning theory focuses on learning as an active process, which is personal and individual for each student. Teachers can utilize constructivism to help understand that each student will bring their own path to the classroom every day. Teachers in constructivist classrooms act as more of a guide to helping students create their own learning and understanding. They help them create their own process and reality based on their own path. This is crucial to helping many kinds of students take their own experiences and include them in their learning. The fourth learning theory is the humanism learning theory. Humanism is very closely related to constructivism. Humanism directly focuses on the idea of self-actualization. Everyone functions under a hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization is at the top of the hierarchy of needs. It's the brief moments where a person feels all of their needs are met and that they're the best possible version of themselves. Everyone is striving for this, and learning environments can either move toward meeting needs or away from meeting needs. Teachers can create classroom environments that help students get closer to their self-actualization. Educators can help fulfill students' emotional and physical needs, giving them a safe and comfortable place to learn, plenty of food, and the support they need to succeed. This kind of environment is the most conducive to help students learn. The fifth and last learning theory is the connectivism learning theory. Connectivism is one of the newest educational learning theories. It focuses on the idea that people learn and grow when they form connections. These can be connections with each other or connections with the roles and obligations in their lives. Hobbies, goals, and the people can all be connections that influence learning. Teachers can utilize connectivism in their classrooms to help students make connections to things that excite them, helping them learn. Teachers can use digital media to make good positive connections to learning. They can help create connections and relationships with their students and with their peer groups to help students feel motivated about learning. So how do we apply these learning theories in teaching? Teachers can create specific strategies and techniques to apply these learning theories in their classrooms. Teachers need to first focus on getting a well-rounded education to learn about all kinds of techniques for teaching and classroom management. Teachers need to understand learning theories to be prepared to utilize them in their classrooms. An understanding of learning theories helps teachers connect to all different kinds of students. Teachers can focus on different learning styles to reach different students, creating teaching that focuses directly on students' needs and aptitudes. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening.
So as you can see, this is basically a good video that I found on YouTube, which allows us to essentially, understand the application of teaching theories, to lesson planning. And I think the crucial bit, which essentially was a part of the video, was towards the end, wherein how teachers can actually look at applying these teaching theories, in particular. So these teaching theories in particular to, the situation at hand. So this bit in terms of how they can be, applied in the classroom is what we want to study when we look at the application of the learning theories in teaching. So you can use these theories to create specific strategies and techniques that can be applied, to designing or creating and engaging an interactive classroom with students or learners. And obviously, as tutors, instructors, trainers, we need to first focus on getting a well-rounded education so that we are able to learn all about the different kind of techniques which are required for teaching in classroom, and obviously looking at classroom management. And this would allow, these theories would basically allow us to understand how we can best prepare the classroom to meeting the needs of the learners, and making sure that the classroom and the activities that we shortlist are essentially interactive, engaging, and they are helping us achieve the objectives which have been set, during the course of our lesson planning, for the, is being done in order to prepare effective lesson plans. Now, with this bit of understanding, let's go into, things like the assessment criteria. Now here, the first assessment criteria talks about designing a lesson plan that meets the individual need of learners. Now here, what I would suggest is, because we are talking about designing a lesson plan, what we need to be able to do at this stage is basically look at an actual preparation of a lesson plan that you would do. And that would be done basically by choosing an area or a field that you are likely to teach in. So for example, in my case, I'm doing the teaching right now for the teaching and education course. For me, designing a lesson would mean that I need to make sure that it is going to help me impart the knowledge which is required for you to understand what is lesson planning. So in order to design a comprehensive lesson plan, I would need to look at obviously assessing learners' need, which will be using the VARC style questionnaire. Then I will be looking at creating using a lesson planning template, and then setting very clear objectives which could be used primarily for the purposes of delivery, and then tailoring it to the content which is required to be delivered as knowledge, and that knowledge would help gain skills for the learners or students in my class. Now, this could be SMART objectives that I do and I keep, and using the SMART acronym and the template again, I create these objectives which are going to be smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. And these would provide a bit of clarity and focus on what kind of objectives I'm setting in the lesson planning. Then I could look at adapting my teaching strategies. I could look at a differential form of instruction if I have varying needs or different types of learners in the classroom. I would also be looking at taking a regular assessment and feedback. And this would be primarily done through the route of, looking at, say, for example, making use of resources or different forms of assessments. And that would inform me whether the delivery of the lesson is going as per the needs and requirements of the learners, and also helping the achievement of the objectives. I will be using plenty of resources that could be interactive to make the lesson interactive and engaging. And these resources could be IT resources, could be printouts, handouts, activities that are planned that could be done by the students in the class. And they would be looking at, again, helping me meet the individual learner's need. And then by following this particular technique, it'll help me to create a lesson plan. Now, a live example that I would want to give you is, for example, I'm preparing to deliver this particular session today. What I've done is I've gone through the unit specification, looked at the learning 4 outcome. I've looked at the indicative specs or indicative content which has to be covered in this session. And then basis that, what I've done is I've created a lesson plan. And that lesson plan allows me to look at considering these 4 or 5 broad areas that I've just spoken about. Things like what are my learner needs going to be? Or how do I set clear objectives? How do I look at the most appropriate teaching strategy for this particular learning outcome? How do I look at providing instruction to learners on this course and on this unit? And then towards the end, how do I take feedback? How do I look at assessment and feedback? And in between, for designing this particular session and delivery of this particular session, I've also evaluated the different kind of resources that I would need in order to effectively deliver this through the Zoom meeting. So in my case, I've looked at PowerPoint presentation. I've shortlisted a video from YouTube. I've looked at creating a few slides. And then my other forms of feedback that I'm going to look at is going to ask you regular questions, confirm what I'm teaching and what I'm delivering is meeting your requirements. You're able to understand this, and there is a clear connection in terms of what I'm teaching and what you're understanding, and that is helping you to go forward and obviously understand the content of what we are discussing today, which is basically dipping into applying learning theories to be able to design an effective lesson plan. Now let's look at an example. So I've explained that to you verbally, but what I want to do is obviously show this to you visually as well. Now, assuming I was planning a lesson and that would be looking at meeting individual needs of the learners. I'm teaching, for example, somebody at grade 6 or year 6. And in those cases, I'm teaching, for example, science. And in general science, I'm teaching one of the topics that I'm going to be planning my lesson for today in specific is cells and microorganisms. Now, what I will do is in the lesson plan, I will define an objective. I will look at material or resources. I will look at the duration of what my session is going to be. And then along with that, what I will do is also start and decide how I would progress into the lesson, how the lesson will commence, how it will run, and how towards the end of my time duration of my class, the lesson will end. So I've defined a procedure here that I'm going to do a bit of a warm-up or an icebreaker session for about 5 minutes, to an introduction to cells and microorganisms for about 10 minutes. This could be using visual aids like projector slides, or in some cases images and charts, using PC to be able to project on the interactive screen and share that with my students in the class. Then in terms of the main activity which I'm going to do in terms of teaching and delivering would be to look at creating an activity which will allow me to break the children or the students down into groups, and they would then discuss this particular activity in groups, thereby discussing key bits of the cells and microorganisms as topic that I've covered today or I'm looking at covering today. And these activities which are planned would allow essentially the learners to be able to pick up the important bits of information required for them to grasp and understand the topic today, which is cells and microorganisms. Some part of the activity that I've designed could be hands-on. That means they'll be looking at slides under microscope, and this would then mean that they are going to be obviously interacting, engaging, and talking to each other in terms of how do I magnify this, and bits and pieces in terms of excitement, which could also come through when they are trying to look at cells and microorganisms under the microscope. I would also then assign some activities to learners or students in this case to say, you would need to do a bit of research using textbook and online sources, and these are the tasks that you're going to research about or gather information about, and they would be then allowing cognitive skills to be built into the session into my session, and that would allow the learners to then go back, or later in the when they go back home later, they would be looking at doing a bit of research to understand what they did in the class and gather more information about the topic, which is cells and microorganisms. They would produce visual presentations. They could use flashcards or charts and posters in the classroom, including asking learners or students in this case to draw out some of the cells or microorganisms that they are seeing under the microscope, and this would bring out a bit more creativity and development of cognitive skills in terms of also working together to be able to produce and then see what the other person or student saw and what they have seen as a perspective, thereby making the discussions interactive. Towards the end of the class, I would also maybe look at a closure. That means I'll recap what I've discussed today, what are the things that we've done, and how this would be useful for them to basically memorize and remember in terms of the topic and the coverage that I've done on cell and microorganisms. There could be a bit of follow-up homework that I would do with regards to research activity that they would be required to do, and that is something that you can give up as a bit of a follow-up work or extension activities that they can bring back to the session next week or in the next class. And that could become the starting point wherein you start off with a bit of an icebreaker or warm up, and that would allow you to be looking at practically a lesson plan. Now, these activities that you do, you're gathering feedback, you're taking feedback from the learners, you're making or cross-checking by quizzes, questions and answers, or asking them a lot of questions to say that they are essentially understanding what we are discussing. And that feedback process that you do in terms of regularly and continuously asking learners about what they're learning and what they feel about what the information they're getting would be allowing them to pass on some constructive feedback to you. And this constructive feedback would allow you to make improvements in how you design and further prepare your lessons with your learners in the class. And that would be a practical activity that you would need to do or can do essentially. And that would be done through the route of, looking at designing a lesson in your chosen subject area. And that lesson that you're designing in your chosen subject area would then allow you to effectively prepare this and then, present it and adapt it depending on, from time to time in terms of how you're teaching and delivering in the class. Now, I've got one or two, templates in particular that I want to obviously share with you and show you. And these templates essentially would, help you understand the process of lesson planning. And let me just quickly switch you over and then show these various templates to you. You could choose any particular template for the purposes of lesson planning, but obviously it needs to have the 6 overarching objectives that we look at in terms of how lesson planning has to be done. And this would be a vital part of coverage of task 4.1. So let me show you one of them. This is a lesson plan template, which is for, say, for example, primary and secondary schools. But basically what we are looking at is we are looking at basics of what day the lesson is planned, what term, what week, what is the year, and the duration of your lecture or your session. You're looking at what are the key learning areas or topics. So in this case, it is cells and microorganisms. What is the focus topic that you put down by looking at going into further details? So you're looking at the cellular structure of single cell organisms, which is for discussion, assuming it was a grade 6 lecture today. And then you put across things like, analysis of the learner's needs. So look at prior knowledge if they have, look at any special considerations. You detail out a bit of topic in detail in terms of what will be the coverage during the discussions. And then you do a bit of organization of the topic, which is where you look at management of resources, looking at your instructional methods or delivery. And then last but not the least, you're looking at obviously the physical environment, which is also looking at resources. And then, the process through which you are going to look at feedback. And then in some cases, if you're doing a physical class, then you're also assessing safety and health and safety risks to ensure that everything which is being used during the activity as equipment or the classroom itself where the session is happening, and if there's a bit of movement or group discussion or things like that in terms of activities, then is the area safe enough for the learners to be able to move around and obviously participate in those activities. and that would involve a bit of safety and health and safety assessment. You might also look at resources, and we break them down into physical resources, equipment related resources, or resources that are required to deliver the lesson, which could be intellectual resources. And then what are the outcomes that you're planning from the session? And then what are the assessment criteria that you're hitting in terms of key objectives? They are all detailed out in this particular lesson plan. This is a very detailed lesson planning template. And then towards the end, you look at self-evaluation or assessment and feedback, as I mentioned. So this is maybe the template that you can look at customizing and using it for the purposes of lesson planning. Now, there are lots of different types of templates. I'll show you another one. And the reason I want to show you a few is because there is no one template which fits all requirements, but it could be something that you tailor make, and you kind of pick one up and then tailor it to your requirements in terms of how you teach and deliver. For example, this is one such lesson planning template wherein you look at the course title, target group, slightly designed differently. What are the learning outcomes you're planning to cover? What are the teaching methods, resources required? This is more so for example, for higher education or further education courses. And then how do you structure the lesson? So you've looked at 5 minutes for self-introduction, then 10 minutes for certain parts of the topic, then breaking it down. And then towards the end also you put some references down in terms of what are the key reference points that you're going to be using in order to be able to achieve the aims and objectives of the lesson. And then there is something which is important again as well, which you could look at, which is the individual learning plan. Sometimes you would see, because of the differential needs of your learners, you would need to create activities, and diverse need of your learners, you need to create activities or give them tasks which are going to be specific for them and utilizing their own skill set. And let's put it this way, their learning styles and their abilities with prior knowledge. And this is what you would be requiring to fill up if the learners are lacking behind, or obviously if they are not because of their disability or special needs or their prior knowledge or learning styles or abilities. If they need to then do some extra work, or in some cases additional work to be able to meet the criteria, then you will set those targets in the individual learning plan. Now, this is based on the assessment which is done using learning styles first, and then the prior skills and abilities of the learner. And then what you're going to do is obviously how you're going to support them to gain or improve those skills by setting targets using smart planning, and that could be done using the individual learning plan template. So again, this is just a guide here in terms of what is required to be done and what could be done. And sometimes what we do is we basically look at customizing some of these templates to ensure that they are meeting the requirements of the learner, rather than using them as bulk standards. And there's no right and wrong template for this, but essentially you could pick out something which is starting off with a particular template, and then tailor it to meet the learner's requirement. So I hope this bit is clear, and it gives you a perspective of how do we look at designing a lesson plan that meets the individual needs of learners. Now, going into any questions, feel free to ask me and stop me there and then, not a problem at all. Let's go into the second assessment criteria that talks about understanding how we look at meeting the needs of learners. But when we are looking at meeting the needs, what we are looking at is how do we deliver these lesson plans which can help in monitoring the achievement and progress of the learners. So lesson plan is an important piece, as I mentioned to you, as an important tool within the teacher's tool set. So what it will also do is help you track your learners' achievement and progress. Now, how does that happen? This happens by when you're using the lesson plan to essentially look at, let's say you're clearly mentioning what are the learning outcomes to be achieved. And if we do feel that there are gap areas, then you use the SMART template or acronym to be able to then define very clear objectives of what your lesson planning is to accomplish. And these are then built up into what is called the assessment criteria. So we use various forms of assessment methods to be able to understand the student progress. This could be done in the form of discussions, quizzes, assignments, case studies, or reports, or witness statements. and this would inform you how the learner is actually progressing. Now, when we look at assignments, we look at assignments which can be graded in the form of rubrics cube. We could look at checklists. We could also look at certain specific performance indicators which are related to individual learners or learners with special abilities or needs. And in those cases, what you generally see is that individual learning plan template, which I've shown you just a couple of minutes back, would be quite useful to list out those activities, which then can be later on tracked for completion. And if these activities are completed, that should allow the learners to achieve, that skill, or obviously better that, or cover that gap area which has been diagnosed as, or which has been essentially propped up or diagnosed, while we are trying to monitor the progress of our learners. You could also look at embedding formative feedback. We generally see this as a good practice when we have assessments which are done by assignments, case studies. Generally, all lecturers, teachers, tutors, instructors would encourage learners to send over a draft of their work to get some ongoing feedback to see whether there's the work or the line that they've on the line that we are going to essentially go and complete the work. Say, for example, if you take a particular approach, then whether that approach is useful or not. And that can be something which can be discussed during the formative feedback process. That means you're giving feedback on an ongoing basis on the work which the learners are completing. And if there is, if there are bits and pieces which are needing correction, adapting, then that can be done when they are reviewed, using formative feedback. There could be varied forms of assessments that are done, and they could include tests. One of the things that we have to look at is there are 16 different forms of assessment methods. So when we talk about, 16 different forms of assessment method, there are, different methods which include, let's say, tests, examinations. So first of all, what I will look at is, if I classify them as 3 different types, assessment methods can be diagnostic, formative, and summative. Now, within these assessment methods, what you'll generally see is that these assessment methods can be of different types. They can be formative assessment, they can be summative assessments, they can be portfolio, observational, self-assessment, or peer assessments. So when we talk about these then can be further subdivided into things like tests, oral examinations, viva, projects, practical demonstrations, portfolios, looking at witness, looking at observation reports, looking at tests and quizzes, and even, write-ups as assignments and case studies. So these are diverse form of assessment methods which, or strategies which teachers, tutors, lecturers, instructors follow, and they help in one way or the other to obtain a very comprehensive view of students' achievement on what is being delivered or planned during the delivery of the lesson. Then we also look at, taking constructive feedback. This is based on the performance of the student. This feedback is taken specifically on areas wherein we feel that there are improvements that can be done. And we encourage, obviously, 360 feedback as a process, 360-degree feedback as a process, which basically means that the learners or the student is able to give feedback, the teacher is able to give feedback, the parents are able to give feedback, and overall somebody who's superior or your peer who's managing you is also able to give feedback. And this approach looks at the process wherein the reflection, looks at reflection as a process, and obviously allows further progress to be made when it comes to setting goals and obviously looking at further development. And this would be very important as far as the process of, the process of, for example, monitoring is concerned. So in practice, if I look at summarizing, what we are looking at is that there are lots of ways through which we can monitor learners' achievement and progress. These could be done through documenting process. It could be done through adjusting lesson plans as needed, and in some cases, varying or adjusting our assessment strategies to be able to engage and interact with learners, and thereby also looking at what are their achievements or what are their accomplishments and how these accomplishments would help them achieve the goals and objectives set within the lesson planning. And they would help us understand how do we look at monitoring the achievement and progress of learners. Any questions on this? Okay, now we come to the last assessment criteria, which talks about how learners enable, how do you enable learners and others to be able to provide feedback to inform lesson planning. So when we talk about this as a process, others in general, who could be the others? Others could be, in this case, parents. It could be, people who are indirectly associated with the process of teaching and learning. So when we talk about others in general, we are going to be looking at ensuring that there is a holistic approach of taking or gathering feedback from all possible sources within educational institution or within a setup where, we are looking at improving the outcomes by better planning lessons. So this could be done in terms wherein you have external stakeholders, which could be parents, which could be, different regulators or bodies like Ofcall. Once they visit a particular institution once in 4 years, audit them, inspect them, quality assurance agencies, they would be stakeholders and they would be able to provide feedback. So when we say others to provide feedback, they would include these regulators, parents, other agencies which work directly or indirectly with a particular educational setup and then are responsible for audit and assurance side of things to see whether the quality of the education is being maintained. And they would be the ones which will be termed as others that are able to provide feedback on lesson planning. So sometimes what I've seen as a practical example is that when we have inspections, we have Ofsted inspectors coming in and they would like to do a teaching observation for the teacher on the days that they are present here. And they would also like to meet some of the learners. Now, the reason of why they want to meet and obviously look at meeting some of the learners and look at doing a lesson observation is to see whether there is appropriate resources, whether the knowledge of the teacher or the lecturer who's actually teaching the student is adequate. And the other bit that they will also look at is whether these lessons are engaging and interactive, thereby allowing the learners to be able to grasp the information within those sessions. So these are important areas that you would generally see where, others will be looked at, and in quote unquote, others will also provide feedback to inform lesson planning. Now, other points that we look at is how do we look at this structured approach of, getting constructive feedback. One is you'll be looking at surveys and questionnaires. You'll also be looking at, for example, one-on-one conversations. Sometimes the aid of technology, with the use of technology, online platforms can also be used to gather, feedback. So when you look at today learning through blended, when we look at blended learning in general, what we do see is universities, colleges, other awarding institutions, have a process through which they're able to, or a portal through which they're able to essentially provide information. This portal tends to be Moodle, Blackboard, or some of the other technological aids which allow learners to get teaching and learning material, electronically through this platform. Now, these learner management systems also look at tracking learners' usage and progress across the course. So obviously, online tracking and tracking of their, let's say, tracking in terms of their journey, in terms of how they get into it, how they use it, how often they use it, and obviously what are they using it for, allows these online platforms to also collect feedback. And they are quite useful for teachers to look at how much of self-study, for example, the learners are doing on their own offline, which is not in front of or in the classroom or not on the face-to-face classroom. Then what is the online or outside the classroom learning that they're doing on their own on a self-study basis. We'll also look at things like open-ended questions, active listening, and also looking at reviewing the feedback which has been received, from examiner reports, for example, or external visits, or for example, in parent-teacher governor meetings. Essentially those feedbacks would also be, these meetings or points would also be able to provide feedbacks, or play into the feedback process, wherein let's say the I'll put it this way, rephrase that these meetings which can happen with parents, outside agencies which are going to be responsible for audit, and in some cases for quality assurance, would also be looking at providing feedback, through a report or through a structured report, which is then published to say that we've been inspected by Ofsted, or we've been inspected by quality assurance agency, and they will be also having areas which will allow this feedback process to essentially, work. And what this will do in summary is that it will allow teachers to basically better plan the lesson. Now, how would you better plan the lesson? Looking at managing certain activities, looking at ensuring that you are able to use these activities to engage with all forms of all types of learners. You're looking at making the classroom inclusive, making, using some of these activities, resources, and, the learning objectives, making it clear, and thereby looking at effectively managing a classroom. And then at some stage, also looking at getting feedback to on your teaching and learning side of things to ensure that you are able to adapt your lesson planning to meet the requirements of learners. Now, a practical example that I will give you is that at the end of our sessions, what we normally do is ask the learners to do a course survey. Now, this course survey has a number of multiple choice questions on a Likert scale, which will say disagree, or, it will say agree, it will say neutral, or in some cases it will say strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly disagree, or in between, agree, do not agree, or have a stance wherein you are neither positive nor negative. Now, when we do these course surveys and we distribute these questionnaires, what we're expecting the learners to essentially do is fill them up. And when they fill them up, when we get the outcome of it, what we are looking at then sitting down and analyzing is that what has the feedback, process, which is worked, what is the feedback process? How is it gone about collecting the data, and what are the results that it is primarily showing in terms of the process is what we are going to be looking at, when we incorporate these surveys or look into, the feedback which has been given by employees. Now, this allows us to look at, as a teacher, as me, when we serve this course survey, it will give me a very clear idea whether my lessons are long, short, lessons are interactive, do I give enough opportunities to ask questions, and was the later lesson active and engaging? Those are the bits that we want to understand after the delivery of the course is done. But in order to do so, we will build this part of the feedback mechanism into place so that it allows lecturers to also get feedback from time to time and adjust their session times, their delivery, maybe the way we ask questions, do activities like maybe showing a video or a quiz, or maybe looking at giving you a bit of a self-study, articles for reading after the session, and that would inform us that whether it is making sense, whether it's adding value, or whether it's giving you the knowledge required to be able to cover this learning outcome sufficiently. So feedback becomes a very important cog in the process of lesson planning, and that is why there's a lot of emphasis paid on the feedback process being iterative, the feedback process being continuous, and the feedback process needs to be followed through in all the activities to ensure that the teaching and learning side of things are engaging and also interactive and allowing the learners to progress and learn and achieve the objectives. So I hope that's okay. Any questions on the discussion that we've done so far? Please feel free to ask me any questions that you have. Okay, so what I'm going to do is obviously look at, for further reading, there are 1 or 2 topics that I put forward here: how to give feedback and recognizing and recording progress for achievement and feedback. These are 2 additional topics that I would want you to go ahead and read, which will relate to learning outcome 4 that we have covered, and hopefully they will allow you to crystallize and obviously get knowledge in terms of this particular learning outcome. I will see you in the next session, and that is where we'll be looking at covering learning outcome 5. Till then, thank you for being on the session, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.